Today, we're digging into something pretty heavy, but so important. Why do massive, smart organizations sometimes fail in the most catastrophic ways imaginable? It's almost never just bad luck. Turns out there's a hidden structure to these disasters, and if you can understand it, you might just be able to prevent them. So let's get into it.
So this is the big question, right? You see these headlines, a shuttle disaster, a huge corporate collapse, and you just have to wonder how. How could so many brilliant people not see it coming? We tend to think these things are just sudden, unpredictable accidents. But what if they're not? What if the warning signs were flashing for everyone to see?
You know, the first thing people usually think is that it all comes down to one person making one huge mistake. Or maybe one little piece of equipment failing at the absolute worst moment. But the research, it shows that's almost never the real story. That one mistake is usually just the very last domino to fall in a long, long line of them.
And this brings us to a really core idea for today, the disaster incubation period. See, disasters don't just happen out of the blue. They incubate, they grow, sometimes for years. All during this time, these tiny mistakes, these ignored warnings, these little problems that nobody fixes, they just keep building up, layer after layer, until the whole system is just waiting to collapse. So if this stuff is building up for so long, why don't we see it? Well, it turns out organizations have some very predictable ways of going blind.
Okay, so if the warning signs are there, why in the world are they being missed? Well, the research we're diving into today points to 3 specific ways organizations basically become blind to risk. And we're not talking about simple miscommunications here. These are deep, systemic failures that stop an organization from seeing, understanding, and then acting on the danger that is sitting right in front of its face.
All right, let's break this down. We're going to look at the 3 big ways that critical information gets lost, ignored, or just plain blocked.
Think of it like a 3-step road to disaster. First, you've got what are called epistemic blind spots. That's where you literally can't even see the problem. Then you get risk denial. This is where you see it, but you convince yourself it's not a big deal. And finally, there's structural impediment, which is when you see the problem, you know it's a big deal, but the system itself actually stops you from doing anything about it. Okay, enough with the theory. Let's see what this actually looks like in the real world. Because these aren't just abstract ideas. No, these are the very root causes of some of the biggest, most infamous organizational failures in modern history. So first up, epistemic blind spots. This is when the warning signs are right there, but they just don't register. The information comes in, but it clashes so hard with what everyone already believes to be true that it gets filtered out or twisted to mean something else. It's not that people don't have the data, it's that they literally cannot process what it means.
Let's take the collapse of Enron. The investigation after the fact found more than a dozen huge red flags. But here's the wild part. The board wasn't kept in the dark. They had the information. They saw the reports. They even personally authorized the sketchy transactions. But there was this powerful shared belief that all these risky financial tricks were just a necessary part of Enron's amazing, innovative business. The warnings didn't fit that story, so they were ignored.
And listen, we're not talking about some small accounting error here. We're talking about the board knowingly, actively allowing $27 billion, that's billion with a B, to be shuffled off the company's books. That number, it's not just a statistic. It's a measurement of the sheer scale of blindness that can happen when a shared story becomes more powerful than the facts staring you in the face.
All right, our second information failure is called risk denial. And this is different from a blind spot. Here, the warning signals are seen, they're heard, people are even writing them down, but the organization just actively denies how important they are. It's a choice, conscious or not, to believe that a huge risk is actually totally fine. The story of the drug Vioxx is just a textbook, tragic example. I mean, just look at this timeline. The first major alarm bell goes off in 2000 in a top-tier medical journal. Then in 2001, another one. In 2002, a study directly links the drug to a higher risk of death. And yet, for 4 whole years, the company publicly waved away all the data. The warnings weren't missed, they were dismissed.
And here's the kicker. We know they knew. In an internal email from way back in 2000, Merck's own chief scientist admitted, quote, "The cardiovascular risks are clearly there." This wasn't a failure of science. It was a failure to act on what the science was screaming. That is the absolute essence of risk denial.
And that brings us to our last one, structural impediment. Honestly, this one might be the most maddening of all.
Because in this situation, people see the warning. They totally get the risk. They want to do something about it, but the organization itself, the rules, the bureaucracy, it all gets in the way.
The Space Shuttle Columbia disaster is just a heartbreaking example. Engineers on the ground were terrified that a piece of foam had smashed into the shuttle's wing during launch. They knew they needed to get a better look, to get more images, to see how bad the damage was. They asked 3 separate times, and all 3 times, management said no, partly because their requests didn't go through the proper channels, and partly because managers were worried about upsetting the mission schedule. The very structure of the organization prevented a life-saving action from ever being taken.
So, after seeing how all of these failures can lead to absolute ruin, the real question is, what do we do about it? How do we go from just diagnosing the problem to actually preventing it?
And the good news is, each of these failures has a specific antidote. So if you're worried about blind spots, the cure is curiosity. Go out and get more information, and try looking at the problem from totally different angles. If the problem is risk denial, which is usually driven by groupthink, the solution is psychological safety. You have to create a space where it's safe for people to speak up and disagree. And for those structural impediments, you have to intentionally break down the bureaucracy and build a culture that cares more about reliability than it does about rigid rules.
Okay, now let's make this really personal. Here is a super powerful question you can ask yourself to fight off your own biases. Just look at a project you're working on and ask, if you were brand new to this job and inherited this project today with fresh eyes, would you still give it the green light? It's a simple little mental trick to check your own blind spots. And what about your team? Seriously, think about the last big meeting you were in. Was there a real debate? Did people challenge each other? Or did everyone just kind of nod along? A culture where everyone feels pressured to agree is the perfect breeding ground for risk denial. Encouraging people to disagree isn't about being negative, it's a critical safety feature.
So, if we can avoid all these failures, what are we even aiming for? What does a truly vigilant, safe organization actually look like? Well, the research points us to this incredible model called the High Reliability Organization. These are organizations that do insanely risky work day in and day out. We're talking about aircraft carriers, air traffic control, emergency rooms, but they have shockingly few accidents. How do they do it? They practice 5 key habits. They're preoccupied with failure, always looking for tiny problems. They're reluctant to simplify because they know reality is messy. They're deeply sensitive to what's happening on the front lines, listening to the people actually doing the work. They're committed to resilience, so they plan for how to bounce back when things go wrong. And, maybe most important of all, they defer to expertise, meaning the person with the most knowledge makes the call, not the person with the highest rank.
And that really leaves us with one last big question for you to think about. So many of the rules and systems that cause these disasters were actually designed to make things more efficient, faster, and cheaper. But real survival, real resilience, that requires something else entirely. So take a hard look at your own team, your own organization, and ask yourself, is it built just to be efficient, or is it built to survive?